What if the oldest words ever written were not telling us about how things started, but warning us about how things will end? What if the first civilization was not really first, but actually the last people who survived from something much, much older? Under the hot deserts of southern Iraq, where the horizon shakes like an old illusion, pieces of clay whisper about a time the world has forgotten. Each wedge-shaped mark made by hands that died 5,000 years ago still hums quietly with purpose, as if trying to save not just words, but memories themselves. Before we go too deep into the ruins, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you are interested in the kind of history that sleeps between myth and archaeology. And if you are still here, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is. I would like to imagine this story spreading across time zones, carried softly into sleep. The story starts not with answers, but with dust. In the late 1800s, archaeologists digging near Uruk and Eridu dug up thousands of clay tablets. They expected primitive beginnings, uncertain scratches, trial and error, the slow crawl of human invention. What they found instead was a civilization that looked already advanced. Math systems, city grids, laws written in perfect sentences, and records of stars mapped with impossible accuracy. The Sumerians had arrived in history as if stepping out of the ruins of something older. There was no slow evolution, no slow climb from stone to bronze. The earliest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, were not messy settlements. They were geometric, lined up with the stars, and engineered with water systems that are too advanced for their supposed age. Their language appeared fully formed with no known parent language, a linguistic isolate, as if it had been carried from somewhere else and set down whole. History prefers slow progress, one tool leading to the next, but Sumer shattered that rhythm. Its accuracy suggested memory, not invention. Scholars have struggled with this for over a century. How could the first civilization begin already fully grown? How could a people with no written ancestors suddenly produce star charts that match modern observations, use base 60 mathematics that still shapes our clocks today, and build temples lined up to sky events? The deeper excavations went, the stranger it became. The Sumerians themselves offered an answer that still bothers us today. They wrote that kingship, knowledge, and order came down from heaven. They did not claim to invent civilization, only to restore it. One tablet found in Berlin carries a chilling inscription. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a word that changes everything. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, what exactly had been lost? And what did they know of the world before the flood? Imagine holding one of those tablets now, the clay still warm in your palm, its wedge-shaped marks carrying the pulse of a hand that lived before every empire we know. Sometimes, if you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago, a pulse frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have been writing down the last surviving pieces of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps on purpose. Through those marks they recorded not just trade and taxes but medicine, astronomy, and hymns to forgotten gods. One tablet from Nippur records the 584-day cycle of Venus, a feat confirmed only with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars. Others contain math formulas that came before Pythagoras by 1,500 years. Artifacts show similar oddities. Bronze tools appear centuries before the Bronze Age. Cylindrical seals show mechanical devices. And then there is the strange object known as the Baghdad battery, which may have generated electricity 2,000 years before its time. And then there are the stories. The Sumerians spoke of a great flood that ended an earlier world. The same story appears in Akkadian texts, in Hebrew scripture, in Hindu epics, even in Mesoamerican codices. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountains, by thousands of years, all remembering the same disaster. How could they all carry the same memory? Perhaps memory itself drifts like silt, settling wherever consciousness finds room. Or perhaps the ancients shared more than we allow ourselves to imagine. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Uruk, they expected crude beginnings. Instead, they found city walls stretching 6 miles, huge temples lined up with sky points, and beneath one ziggurat, a library of over 40,000 clay tablets. A civilization that documented itself in amazing detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics based on 60, not 10, come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity as though they were remembering rather than discovering? Some researchers suggest that Sumer arose from centuries of forgotten development, small settlements lost to erosion and flood. Others whisper that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an even earlier people, one erased by the disasters that ended the last ice age. And then there are those who read the tablets literally, that the gods who came down from the sky were not divine in the spiritual sense but teachers, travelers, or perhaps remains of a civilization that came before us altogether. But even the skeptics admit something strange. The Sumerian timeline does not fit. Civilizations are not supposed to emerge fully structured. Yet here they did. Agriculture, writing, law, music, medicine all at once. The clay tablets do not show trial and error. They show refinement as though what we call the birth of civilization was to them a rebuilding. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a word that suggests memory, not invention. It is a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes when you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving pieces of an age, erased by flood, time, or perhaps on purpose. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something huge had been taken away. The same way a missing note can haunt an entire song. The same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. Maybe that is why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another 1,000 years, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who were they remembering? They said kingship came down from heaven. Not as a metaphor, not symbolically, but as a statement of fact recorded in clay more than 4,000 years ago. A line that still trembles with something language struggles to contain. After the kingship came down from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It is the opening verse of what we now call the Sumerian king list, a record of rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond the limits of human possibility. But before we can understand who those impossible kings were, we must first see what they left behind. Because the clay tablets are only part of the story. The cities themselves whisper just as loudly. The earliest Sumerian settlements, Eridu, Nippur, were not the messy sprawl of a people learning to live together. They were geometric, planned, lined up with purpose that borders on the strange. When excavators first reached the foundations of Eridu, they expected disorder. What they found instead was layer upon layer of construction. Each temple rebuilt directly on top of the last, stretching back nearly 8,000 years. The oldest structures were not crude experiments. They were already advanced, facing cardinal directions, built on raised platforms to honor sky sightlines, surrounded by canals that flowed with engineered accuracy. The city of Ur, home to the famous ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Nana, reveals the same unsettling pattern. Its streets were laid out in grids. Its walls were massive, reinforced with bitumen and fired brick, materials that required advanced kills and knowledge of chemistry. Homes had drainage systems, courtyards opened to the sky in careful ratios. Even the placement of doorways followed star orientations as though the builders were mapping the heavens onto the earth itself. Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, sat at the center of a network of cities arranged in distances that match musical intervals and sky cycles. Archaeologists have noted that the spacing between major Sumerian settlements reflects the same base 60 ratios used in their mathematics, as if the entire civilization had been composed rather than constructed. This was not accident. It was architecture that remembered something. And then there is the language itself. Sumerian stands alone in the history of human speech. It has no known relatives, no linguistic ancestors, no path leading backward into simpler forms. It appears in the archaeological record fully formed, complex, precise, and strangely isolated. Linguists have spent over a century trying to connect Sumerian to other language families. They have tested it against Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, even Uralic tongues. Nothing fits. It exists outside the tree of language entirely, as though it had been moved from somewhere or someone else. To write in Sumerian was to work with a system that blended sound, symbol, and meaning in ways that feel almost coded. Each cuneiform sign could represent a word, a syllable, or an idea depending on context. The grammar was agglutinative, building meaning through layered suffixes in patterns that required amazing linguistic skill. The Sumerians themselves believed their writing came from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge, whose name means she who counts the stars. They did not claim to invent it. They said it was given. And the more we study their tablets, the harder it becomes to argue otherwise, because the content of those tablets reveals something even stranger than the language itself. Knowledge that should not exist yet. One clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Nippur records the orbital cycle of Venus with stunning accuracy, 584 days, matching modern astronomical observations. Another tablet charts the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, tracking their positions across decades with accuracy that requires multi-generational record-keeping and math models we associate with much later civilizations. Star maps etched into cylinder seals show constellations we still recognize today: the bull, the scorpion, the lion. But they also include sky references that suggest the Sumerians were observing not just the visible sky, but cycles within cycles, precessional shifts that take thousands of years to complete. How could a first civilization track cosmic time on that scale? And then there is the mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal counting, which forms the invisible structure of our modern world. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not random, they are Sumerian. Base 60 allows for easy division. It has more factors than base 10, making perfect for astronomy, geometry, and trade. But it is also a system that requires abstract thinking, an understanding of fractions and ratios that most early cultures took centuries to develop. The Sumerians had it from the beginning. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, reveal math problems involving Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They calculated square roots, solved quadratic equations, and understood geometric progressions. One tablet known as Plimpton 322 lists number sets that suggest trigonometric knowledge we did not think existed until the Greeks. Yet there it sits, carved in clay, silent and patient. The deeper the excavations went, the more the oddities multiplied. Archaeologists dug up evidence of advanced metalworking, bronze alloys that required precise temperature control and knowledge of tin sourcing from distant trade networks. Tools that showed no step-by-step development, no trial and error phase, just sudden skill. They found medical texts describing surgical procedures, medicine recipes using dozens of plant compounds, and body knowledge that suggests dissection and careful observation. One tablet lists symptoms and treatments for over a dozen conditions organized with clinical accuracy. And everywhere throughout the ruins, there was organization. Records of government, tax receipts, property deeds, temple inventories, payroll logs for workers. The kind of complex management that requires not just literacy, but institutional memory, systems passed down and refined over generations. But where were those generations? Where was the awkward beginning? The fumbling first steps, the slow climb from stone to bronze to iron. The Sumerian record shows none of that. It begins already in motion, already advanced, already remembering. The cities themselves seem to echo this. In Uruk, beneath the grand temples dedicated to Inanna and Anu, excavators found older structures. And beneath those older still, each layer more refined than the one above it, as though civilization were shrinking rather than expanding, growing smaller, simpler, more forgetful as it moved forward through time. It is the reverse of what we expect, and it lines up perfectly with what the Sumerians themselves wrote, that kingship, knowledge, and order came down from heaven. Whether they meant gods, teachers, or remains of a forgotten people who survived some ancient disaster. Their words point to one clear idea. Sumer inherited civilization. It did not create it. The clay does not lie. It remembers. And what it remembers is a world that came before. A world that built in straight lines, counted in 60s, tracked the stars across thousands of years, and left behind not ruins, but echoes. Echoes preserved in the geometry of cities, in the isolation of language, in the accuracy of mathematics, and in the unsettling skill of a people who appeared in history already awake. The question that haunts the silence between those clay tablets is not how the Sumerians achieved so much. It is who taught them to remember. Among the thousands of tablets scattered across museum collections and archaeological sites, one document stands apart. Not because it is larger or more fancy, but because of what it dares to claim. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it reads like a record of impossibility. The tablet begins with a single line carved in the same wedge-pressed cuneiform used for grain tallies and trade receipts. After the kingship came down from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What follows is a list of rulers, names, cities, reign lengths, stretching backward through time until the numbers themselves break apart into something that no longer feels human. 8 kings are named, 8 rulers who governed the world before the flood. And their reigns are not measured in decades or even centuries. They are measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king, reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar, the second, for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. On the list continues. Each name paired with a city, Eridu, Badtibra, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and each reign impossibly long as though time itself operated under different laws. In total, these 8 pre-flood kings governed for 241,200 years. Then the tablet records a single sudden sentence. Then the flood swept over. And after that line, everything changes. The reigns shrink. Mortality returns. The kings who follow the flood rule for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans that look human. The age of gods gives way to the age of men. The impossible becomes the historical. The mythic collapses into the ordinary, but the change is smooth. The king list does not tell the two eras apart in tone or style. It treats both with the same matter-of-fact accuracy as though recording not fantasy but memory. And that is what bothers scholars most because the Sumerian king list was not written as mythology. It was not a hymn or a prayer or a poem meant to inspire. It was a government document etched in the same cuneiform script used for tax records, temple inventories, and grain receipts. It was copied and recopied across centuries with each scribe treating it as real history. The cities named in the list are real. Eridu, the first city, has been excavated. Its ruins stretch back nearly 8,000 years. Layer upon layer of temples built and rebuilt in the same sacred spot. Shuruppak, home to the flood hero Ziusadra, has been confirmed. Larak and Sippar, both real, both verified by archaeology. These were not imaginary places. They were the anchors of a civilization that kept records obsessively, that valued accuracy, that documented everything from the movement of stars to the wages of workers. So why would they list kings who ruled for 36,000 years? Some scholars dismiss the numbers outright, calling them exaggerations meant to give divine legitimacy to later rulers. Others see them as copying errors built up through centuries of copying, but neither explanation accounts for the consistency. Multiple versions of the king list survive from Nippur, from Larsa, from Isen. And while details vary, the structure remains the same. 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, then the flood, then mortality. It is too careful to be accident. And then there are those who notice the mathematics. The numbers in the king list are not random. They follow a pattern. Almost all of the pre-flood rains are multiples of 3,600. A unit the Sumerians called the shar. In their cosmology, the shar represented not just a span of time, but a sky cycle, the period it took for certain planetary alignments to return to their starting positions. Alulim's reign, 28,800 years, equals 8 shars. Alalgar's reign, 36,000 years, equals 10 shars. Enmenluana's reign, 43,200 years, equals 12 shars. The pattern repeats. The numbers are not lifespans. They are astronomical codes, epochs marked by the turning of the heavens rather than the beating of human hearts. To scholars who see the king list through this lens, the pre-flood kings were not individuals. They were symbols, guardians of sky ages, embodiments of planetary cycles, representatives of eras so huge that only the stars could measure them. Perhaps kingship coming down from heaven was not a metaphor at all, but a statement of cosmic order, a system where rulers were chosen not by family line, but by alignment with the sky itself. But even this interpretation raises a question that hovers over the entire document like a shadow. Why would a government culture encode astronomy into their royal family line? Unless they believed the two were inseparable. Unless they saw time, kingship and sky motion as a single woven thread, one that had been cut by the flood and had to be remembered, preserved, passed down in clay so it would never be forgotten again. Because to the Sumerians, the king list was not allegory. It was history. They believed these kings existed. They believed the reigns were real, even if the scale defied human understanding. And they believed the flood that ended that age was not a story invented to explain suffering. It was a memory of an actual disaster, one so huge it reset the clock of civilization itself. The flood did not erase fantasy. It erased memory. And everything that followed, every city, every temple, every cuneiform mark pressed into wet clay was an attempt to recover what had been lost, to rebuild not just civilization, but remembrance. The king list is a document of survival, a way of saying this is what we were, this is what we came from, this is what the flood took away. And perhaps that is why the numbers feel so wrong to us, because they are not meant to measure time the way we do. They are meant to measure loss, the distance between what was and what remains, the gap between the age when knowledge came down from heaven and the age when humanity had to learn everything again, slowly, painfully from pieces. When you hold that tension between the government accuracy of the king list and the cosmic impossibility of its numbers, you begin to understand why the Sumerians copied it so carefully, why they treated it as real, why they refused to edit the reigns into something more believable. Because to change the numbers would be to forget, and forgetting to them was the only true death. The flood had already taken one world. The clay tablets were their promise that it would not take the memory of that world as well. So the king list remains pressed into clay, silent and patient, a record of 8 kings who ruled before the waters came, whose names still carry the weight of eras we can no longer imagine, and whose reigns mark the boundary between the world we know and the world that drowned. And just beyond that boundary, beneath the rising waters of the flood, lies the question that haunts every line of the king list. If these kings were real, what kind of world did they rule? The answer lies buried beneath 10 feet of silt. When archaeologists first reached the deeper layers of ancient Sumerian cities, they expected continuity, one civilization flowing into the next, layer upon layer of living marking the slow passage of time. What they found instead was interruption. A clean band of sediment, uniform, lacking pottery shards, ash or human trace. Flood deposit. The excavation team led by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s dug through the ruins of temples and homes until their shovels struck clay. Thick water-laid clay that stretched down 8 feet before reaching the burned remains of an older settlement beneath. Woolley stood in the trench and realized he was looking at the physical boundary between two worlds. Below the silt, charred walls, shattered pottery, the bones of a city that had ended in fire. Above the silt, new foundations, rebuilt temples, a civilization rising again from silence. The same pattern appeared at Shuruppak, the city of Ziusadra, the flood hero. Beneath the ruins, a layer of silt, and at Kish, another band of sediment marking the same violent disruption. The dates varied slightly around 2900 BCE, but the message was clear. Something had swept over the land. The Sumerian tablets describe it with stark simplicity. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no drama, just a single line dividing history into before and after, the age of gods and the age of men, the world of impossible reigns and the world of mortality. And that simplicity, coming from a culture that recorded everything in exhausting detail, feels more like witness testimony than myth. Because the Sumerians did not write the flood as allegory. They wrote it as record, as memory, as the moment when the old world drowned and the new one began, smaller and more fragile, but determined to remember what had been lost. The oldest account comes from a tablet discovered in Nippur, written in Sumerian centuries before the Hebrew Bible. For 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. The huge boat was tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters. The hero of this story is Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days or he who found life. In the Akkadian tradition, he is called Utnapishtim, in Hebrew texts Noah, but the structure remains constant across all tellings. A man warned by a god, a vessel built in secret, a deluge that erases the world, and a survival that preserves not just life but knowledge. According to the tablets, Enki, the god of wisdom, keeper of the sacred me, the divine principles of civilization, came to Ziusudra in a dream, or perhaps through the wall of a reed hut, whispering so the other gods would not hear. The assembly of the gods, led by Enlil, had decided to end humanity. The noise of mortals had grown too great. The world had become unbalanced. The decree was final, but Enki could not bear to see knowledge die with the people who carried it. So he warned Ziusudra. He told him to build a vessel, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard the seed of all living things, not just animals but craftsmen, musicians, scribes, the keepers of memory, the bearers of the me. Abandon riches and seek life. Despise property and keep the soul alive. When the rains came, they did not stop. The tablets say the storm raged for 7 days. The great boat was tossed upon waters so huge they covered the mountains. The world below, temples, cities, fields, everything vanished beneath the churning dark. And then silence. When the waters went down, Ziusudra released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven did not return. It had found land. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and Ziusudra made an offering of thanks. The gods smelled the smoke and came down, realizing too late that they had nearly erased their own creation. Enlil was furious that someone had survived, but Enki defended Ziusudra, saying that wisdom should not die with the wicked. And so as a compromise or perhaps as a burden, Ziusudra was granted immortality and sent to live in the land beyond the rivers, at the mouth of the rivers, a place where the divine and mortal worlds no longer touch. He became memory itself, the living proof of what had been lost. But here is the question that archaeology will not let rest. Was this a story or the echo of a real survival? Because the geological record suggests something happened. Across Mesopotamia, layers of flood silt mark a sudden disastrous flood around the same period the king list places the deluge. Core samples from the Black Sea reveal a dramatic rise in water levels roughly 7,500 years ago, when meltwater from retreating glaciers broke through natural barriers and drowned vast coastal regions in a matter of weeks. The end of the last ice age, around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, was not gradual. It was broken up by violent climate shifts, glacial lake outbursts, and rapidly rising seas. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for thousands of years were submerged. River valleys became seas. Islands vanished. And humanity scattered across those coasts would have watched the waters rise. They would have fled inland. They would have carried what they could. Tools, seeds, stories, and they would have remembered, because a flood that erases your world is not something you forget. It becomes the dividing line in your history, the moment when everything changed. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Genesis, Hindu Matsya Purana, Greek myth of Deucalion, Chinese legend of Gunyu, Mesoamerican tales of the fourth sun destroyed by water. How could civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years all remember the same disaster? perhaps because it was not one flood, but many local disasters caused by the same global climate shift. Each one devastating enough to burn itself into group memory. Or perhaps, as some researchers suggest, there was a single massive event, a comet impact, a glacial collapse, a rupture so huge it reshaped coastlines worldwide and became the flood that all cultures remember. The Sumerians believed the latter. They believed the flood was not local. It was total. It erased the old world, the world of the pre-flood kings, the world where knowledge came down from heaven, the world of impossible. Rains and sky order. And when the waters finally went down, what remained was silence. The gods withdrew. The kings became mortal. The cities had to be rebuilt from pieces. And the survivors, people like Ziusudra, were given the most sacred duty imaginable, to remember, to carry forward the seed of all living things. Yes, but also the seed of all knowing things. The mathematics, the star charts, the medicine, the language, the divine codes that once flowed freely from heaven to earth. That is why the Sumerian tablets feel so urgent. Why the king list was copied and recopied across centuries. Why their cities were rebuilt on the ruins of older cities. Each one an echo of what came before. Because they were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it. And the flood, the great silence that divided their history, was the reason why. After the silence came the teachers. When the floodwaters went down and the survivors came out into a world made strange by absence, they were not alone. According to the tablets, there were beings who remained or returned to help humanity remember what had been lost. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The name itself carries weight. Those who from heaven to earth came, not as a metaphor, not symbolically, but as a title as precise as any family line or title recorded in their government texts. And what stands out immediately, what makes these figures different from the gods of later mythologies, is that they were not described as all-powerful. They were not distant, unknowable forces living beyond mortal reach. They were participants, engineers, builders, lawgivers, teachers who walked among humanity and shared the knowledge needed to rebuild. The tablets describe them with strange specificity. Enki, god of the deep waters and keeper of the me, taught humanity agriculture, irrigation, and the healing arts. He was the one who warned Ziusudra of the flood, who could not bear to see knowledge die. His symbol was the serpent representing wisdom and renewal, and his home was Eridu, the first city where the oldest temples in Mesopotamia still rise from the sand. Enlil, god of air and storms, governed law and order. He was the executive force among the gods, the one who ordered the flood and later granted kingship to mortals. His temple at Nippur was considered the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth connected. To rule without Enlil's blessing was to rule illegitimately. Anu, god of the highest heavens, was the father of the group of gods, distant but foundational. His name appears in star charts and his temple in Uruk was lined up to sky events. He represented the cosmic order itself, the framework within which all knowledge existed. And there were others. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who shaped life from clay. Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose journeys between heaven and the underworld became stories for cyclical death and rebirth. Utu, the sun god, who brought light and justice. But here is what separates the Anunnaki from myth. They were not worshipped as abstract ideals. They were documented, their family trees recorded, their cities named, their interactions with humanity preserved in exhausting detail, as though scribes were recording history, not inventing legend. The most unsettling of these records describes the creation of humanity itself. In the text known as the Atrahasis epic, the gods grow weary of labor. They have built cities, dug canals, raised temples, but the work is endless. And so they come up with a solution: to create beings who will carry the burden in their place. Enki and Ninhursag are given the work. They take clay from the earth, the first mud of creation, and mix it with something else. The tablets say it was the blood of a god, a divine essence sacrificed to give humanity intelligence and spirit. From the flesh of the god, let a spirit remain. Let it proclaim him as a living sign. Let the spirit remain so it is not forgotten. The clay is shaped. The divine blood is mixed in, and from that union humanity is born, part earth, part heaven, mortal in body, but carrying within them a spark of the divine. To modern readers, this sounds like a metaphor, but pause on the language, mixing essence, transferring spirit, creating beings from raw material and inherited code. It reads less like poetry and more like a description of genetic engineering, the intentional design of life through the combination of two sources, one material, one informational, clay and blood, body and blueprint. Scholars dismiss this as mythic symbolism, a way for ancient people to explain their own existence. But the Sumerians were not a culture given to vague allegory. They documented grain shipments and star positions with the same clinical accuracy they used to describe the gods. When they wrote that humanity was made from earth and divine essence, they may have been recording the only way they knew how to describe something they witnessed or inherited memory of but could not fully explain. In the 1970s, researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed a controversial interpretation, that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in search of resources, genetically engineered humanity as a labor force, and left behind the memory of their presence in our myths. Mainstream scholars rejected this reading almost universally. The evidence, they argued, did not support literal visitation. The Anunnaki were archetypes, personified natural forces, sky bodies given human form, or deified ancestors whose achievements grew legendary over time. And yet, the descriptions linger. The Anunnaki were said to be radiant, winged, coming down in flame, moving between heaven and earth in vessels the Sumerians could not name, but tried desperately to show: cylindrical objects, fiery chariots, sky boats that gleamed like lapis lazuli and bronze. Cylinder seals from Uruk show winged figures standing beside what appear to be sky diagrams, planetary orbits, stellar alignments, geometric patterns that resemble nothing in the natural world but everything in the realm of advanced astronomy. And these same descriptions, beings of light coming down from the sky teaching forbidden knowledge, appear across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. The Watchers of Hebrew tradition, the Devis of Hindu texts, the Viracocha of the Andes, the Feathered Serpent of Mesoamerica. How could such consistency emerge independently? Perhaps because they were not independent. Perhaps because the memory of the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, was older than the flood. A memory carried by survivors who scattered to distant shores and rebuilt their civilizations in isolation. Each one preserving pieces of the same original story. Or perhaps the Anunnaki were not visitors from the stars, but survivors of a pre-flood civilization, an advanced culture that possessed knowledge we have only recently rediscovered, and who came out from the disaster to teach the remains of humanity how to begin again. A lost people whose technology seemed so far beyond the understanding of flood survivors that they could only be described as gods. We may never know, but what the tablets make clear, what the Sumerians repeated across thousands of years of record-keeping, is this: civilization was not invented. It was given. Humanity did not stumble into agriculture, astronomy, writing, and law through trial and error. We were taught by beings who came from somewhere else, whether heaven, across the sea, or from the drowned world before the flood. The role of humanity to the Sumerians was not to create. It was to remember, to preserve the knowledge given to us, to carry the divine codes of civilization forward through time so they would not be lost again. The Anunnaki gave humanity the tools, the laws, the language, the star charts, the architecture, and then, according to the tablets, they withdrew. Not entirely, but enough. The age of direct communion ended. The gods became distant. The kings became mortal, and humanity was left with the sacred task of maintaining what had been passed down. The inheritance of a forgotten world encoded in clay, preserved in ritual, and whispered through the long silence of history. And so the question remains, haunting every cuneiform mark pressed into wet clay: what kind of beings were the Anunnaki? And if they truly came from heaven to earth, where did they go when they left? But knowledge is not only preserved in stories. Sometimes it hides in formulas, buried among the hymns to Inanna, the prayers to Enlil, and the epic tales of flood and creation. Archaeologists found something unexpected. Technical manuals, documents with no mythic introduction, no calling of gods, just pure distilled knowledge, metalworking formulas specifying copper to tin ratios for bronze alloys, architectural measurements using geometric proportions, medical texts listing medicine compounds with dosage instructions, agricultural schedules lined up to sky events, and astronomical calculations of such accuracy that modern scientists had to double-check them with computer models before believing they were real. These were not the writings of a civilization learning through trial and error. They were the writings of a civilization remembering. One tablet discovered in the ruins of Nippur, catalogued as VAT 4924, records the synodic cycle of Venus with perfect accuracy, 584 days. This is the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, a measurement that requires multi-generational observation, sophisticated mathematics, and instruments capable of tracking planetary motion with remarkable consistency. The ancient Greeks would not accurately chart Venus for another 2,000 years. European astronomers would not confirm the cycle until the Renaissance, armed with telescopes and centuries of built-up data. Yet, here it was, pressed into clay, precise and patient, as though the Sumerians had simply copied it from an older source. Other tablets record the orbits of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They track moon phases, solar eclipses, and the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle. To observe precession requires not just one lifetime of watching the stars, but generations upon generations of data passed down and carefully preserved. How could the first civilization already possess this knowledge unless they were not the first? And then there is the mathematics. In the 1940s, archaeologists examining tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, found a clay piece now known as Plimpton 322. At first glance, it appeared to be a list of numbers. But upon closer study, mathematicians realized it contained Pythagorean triples, sets of three numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This was more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet was not teaching the concept. It was applying it, using it as a tool for solving complex geometric problems, calculating land measurements, and designing building angles. The knowledge was already built in, already assumed, as though whoever carved those numbers had inherited a system so refined that they no longer needed to explain its origins. Another tablet describes the calculation of square roots using a step-by-step method nearly identical to modern algorithms. Others show an understanding of exponential growth, compound interest, and geometric progressions, concepts that would not resurface in Western mathematics until the work of medieval Arab scholars and Renaissance Europeans. The Sumerians were not discovering these principles. They were using them as though the formulas had been handed down complete, waiting only to be applied. And it was not just abstract knowledge. The physical artifacts tell the same strange story. In the ruins of Ur and Eridu, excavators found bronze tools perfectly cast, alloyed with precise ratios of copper and tin, dated to periods that came before the so-called Bronze Age in the region. The change from stone to bronze is supposed to represent centuries of gradual progress, slow refinement, trial and error. But the Sumerian bronze shows no such evolution. It appears suddenly already optimized, as though the knowledge of metalworking had been moved rather than developed. Cylinder seals from Uruk show what appear to be mechanical devices, wheels, gears, pulleys, objects that seem too advanced for their supposed technological context. Some seals show figures operating what look like looms or drills, machinery that suggests an understanding of torque, leverage, and precision engineering. And then there is the object that refuses to fit any timeline at all. The Baghdad battery, discovered in 1936 near Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad. The artifact consists of a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod, parts that when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, can generate a small electrical current, dated to around 250 BCE. It sits awkwardly in the Parthian period, a time when no one is supposed to have understood electrochemistry. Some researchers suggest it was used for electroplating gold onto jewelry. Others argue it was a ritual object with no real purpose. But the design is clear. A primitive battery built 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta would invent the modern version in 1800. Could the Parthians have stumbled upon this by accident? Perhaps, or perhaps they too were inheriting pieces of knowledge that stretched back further than anyone wanted to admit. Because the site where the battery was found sits on top of layers of older living. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. Each culture building on the ruins of the one before. Each one preserving echoes of what had been lost. The deeper you dig, the older the knowledge becomes. And the more it feels like inheritance rather than invention. The Sumerians had a word for this kind of knowledge, me. It is often translated as divine decree or sacred law. But the meaning is more precise than that. The me were not laws or rules. They were codes, principles, formulas built into the fabric of creation itself. Knowledge that governed not just human civilization, but the structure of reality. There were said to be over 100 me, each one representing a different part of existence. Kingship, priesthood, music, metalwork, writing, warfare, justice, sexual love, decision-making. To possess the me was to possess the blueprint of civilization. And according to the myths, the me were not invented by mortals. They were kept by Enki in the depths of the Abzu, the first waters beneath the earth, and could only be passed to humanity through divine will, or occasionally through clever theft. In one story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the me while he is drunk. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, bringing civilization with her. Enki, realizing what he has done, tries to get them back, but Inanna has already crossed the boundary. The knowledge is released. It is a strange myth, but it carries within it an older truth. Knowledge is transferred, not created. It exists somewhere, in some original form, and civilizations rise or fall based on their ability to access, preserve, and pass it on. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians were trying to tell us. That the science in their tablets, the astronomy, the mathematics, the metalworking was not the product of gradual discovery. It was the product of remembering, of recovering what the flood had nearly erased, of piecing together pieces of a system that had once been whole. The survivors of the deluge did not start from zero. They started from ruins. And within those ruins were inscriptions, tools, star charts, formulas, enough to rebuild if only they could remember what the symbols meant. Perhaps what we call progress is only this, the slow, painful process of remembering what we once knew. And perhaps the Sumerians, rising from the flood with clay still wet in their hands, understood this better than we ever will. That civilization is not built, it is restored. That science is not invented, it is recovered. And that every formula pressed into clay, every star chart lined up to the heavens, every bronze tool cast in fire, is not a triumph of human cleverness, but a monument to survival. A way of saying this is what we saved. This is what the flood did not take. But there is one mystery deeper than the science, older than the cities, more unexplainable than the flood itself. The language. Sumerian stands alone in the history of human speech. Not as a metaphor alone, not poetically isolated, but linguistically orphaned, a tongue with no known relatives, no ancestral roots, no path leading backward into simpler forms. For over a century, linguists have tried to connect Sumerian to other language families. They have tested it against Indo-European, the vast family that includes English, Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian. Nothing. They have compared it to Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew, which later ruled the same region. No match. They have searched for links to Dravidian tongues of India, Uralic languages of Central Asia, even Basque, another linguistic isolate. Every attempt ends in silence. Sumerian does not fit. It exists outside the tree of language entirely, as though it had fallen from somewhere else or risen from something much older. It appears in the archaeological record around 3500 BCE, already fully formed. Complex grammar, sophisticated vocabulary, a writing system so precise it could record poetry, law, medicine, and astronomy with equal clarity. There is no Proto-Sumerian, no transitional stage, no evidence of evolution. It simply is. And then just as suddenly, it vanishes. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian was no longer a spoken language. It survived only as a religious tongue used in temples, preserved by scribes, studied the way Latin would be studied centuries later in medieval Europe. A dead language kept alive through ritual because to forget it entirely would be to cut the last connection to the gods. But even in death, Sumerian continued to haunt the region. Akkadian scribes learned it. Babylonian priests recited it. Assyrian kings carved it on their monuments. For 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken, it remained the language of memory, the tongue in which the oldest truths were recorded. Because to the Sumerians, their language was not a human invention. It was a gift. The tablets say that writing came from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge, grain, and accounting. Her name means she who counts the stars, a title that links literacy with astronomy, record-keeping with sky observation, as though language itself were a form of cosmic measurement. Nisaba was not the goddess of poets or storytellers. She was the goddess of scribes, those who preserved, calculated, and passed on knowledge. To write in Sumerian was to participate in her sacred work. It was an act of preservation, not creation, and the writing system itself reflects that purpose. Cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge, was not an alphabet in the modern sense. It was something older, more layered. Each sign could represent a sound, a word, or an entire concept depending on context. A single wedge-shaped mark could be a syllable in one text and a divine symbol in another. The signs were geometric: triangles, lines, angles, shapes pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. And yet, within that geometry, something else was encoded. Some scholars have noted that Sumerian cuneiform signs often mirror natural forms. The sign for mountain looks like peaks. The sign for water looks like flowing waves. The sign for star is an asterisk radiating light. It was as though the script were not merely representing reality but mirroring it, capturing the shape of things at the level of essence. To write in Sumerian was to perform an act of copying, an attempt to trap divine speech in clay before it faded into silence. The Sumerians did not believe they were inventing language. They believed they were remembering it, recovering something that had been given to them from above or from before. And there is evidence, strange and subtle, that suggests they might have been right. In the 1970s, linguists analyzing Sumerian hymns began noticing something unusual: mathematical ratios built into the structure of the verses. The number of syllables per line, the repetition of certain sounds, the spacing of stressed and unstressed beats, all of it followed patterns that matched harmonic intervals in music. Not by chance, not approximately, precisely. The hymns were composed using ratios like 2:3, 3:4, and 4:5. The same ratios that define musical harmony. The same intervals that the Sumerians used to tune their lyres and harps, the same proportions they built into their architecture and star charts. It was as though language, music, and mathematics were not separate subjects, but expressions of a single unified system, a code that governs sound, meaning, and number at the same time. Some researchers have proposed that this reflects an ancient understanding of reality as vibrational, that the Sumerians believed the universe itself was structured by harmonic principles and that language was the human attempt to resonate with that structure. To speak correctly was to line up with the cosmic order. To write was to encode that alignment into clay. The word the Sumerians used for this kind of knowledge was me, the divine codes we met earlier. But me also carried connotations of sound, vibration, and speech. The gods did not merely think creation into being. They spoke it. And the me were the words they used, the first syllables that shaped reality. If that is true, then Sumerian may not have been a language in the way we understand language today. It may have been something closer to a programming language, a syntax designed to connect with the basic structure of existence itself. And if the flood scattered humanity and divided tongues, as the later story of Babel would claim, then Sumerian may have been the last surviving piece of the original language, the pre-flood tongue, the speech of the world before the waters came. There is a line in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis that echoes this idea. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech before the tower, before the scattering, before the confusion of tongues, one language. The Sumerians never called their language Sumerian. That is a modern name. They called it Emegir, which translates roughly as the noble tongue or the princely language. A name that suggests it was not merely functional but raised, sacred, set apart. And perhaps before the flood, there was a single language spoken by the pre-Diluvian kings, taught by the Anunnaki, encoded into the me, a language where sound, meaning, and mathematics were unified. A language that could describe not just objects and actions, but the relationships between things, the ratios that governed form, the vibrations that structured matter. And perhaps when the flood came and the old world drowned, that language was lost, except for pieces preserved by survivors like Ziusadra, passed down through generations, carefully carved into clay, so it would not be forgotten entirely. By the time the Sumerians appear in history, the language is already ancient, already broken. They do not speak it fluently. They rebuild it the way archaeologists rebuild pottery from shards. They write it down obsessively because they know it is fading. They teach it in temple schools because they sense that to lose it completely would be to lose the last bridge to the world before. And they were right. When Sumerian finally died as a spoken language, something that could never be replaced was lost. A way of thinking, a way of encoding reality, a connection to the divine order that could never quite be recovered in any other tongue. The Greeks would later speak of the logos, the word, the reason, the ordering principle of the cosmos. The Hebrews would speak of the word of God through which all things were made. But the Sumerians had known this first. They had known that language was not random, that it was not invented by humans fumbling toward communication. It was given, coming down from heaven, taught by Nasaba, encoded in the me, structured by the same ratios that govern the stars, the intervals of music, and the proportions of temples. And when we read their tablets now, silent, patient, waiting in museum glass, we are not just reading words. We are reading the last echoes of a unified code of creation. A language that once bridged heaven and earth. A tongue that the gods themselves had spoken. And if we listen closely enough between the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, we can almost hear it still, soft, geometric, singing in ratios we no longer understand. But language was not the only bridge. Long after the flood, long after the old world had been swallowed by water and silence, humanity tried to rebuild what had been lost. Not through words alone, but through stone. They built towers, massive step structures that rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, like mountains that had no right to exist in that flat, endless landscape. The Sumerians called them ziggurats, from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning to build high. And they dotted the cities of Sumer like stairways frozen mid-climb. Ur had one, Uruk had one. Eridu, the first city, had one rising from the oldest sacred ground in Mesopotamia. But the greatest of them all, the one that would echo through history and myth for thousands of years, stood in Babylon. They called it Edamananki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was not a temple in the way we think of temples. It was not a place for worship alone. It was a structure of connection, an attempt to anchor the heavens to the earth, to create a physical point where the divine and mortal worlds could meet again. Because to the Sumerians, that connection had been cut. The flood had not only drowned the old world, it had broken the link between heaven and earth. The gods had withdrawn. The direct connection that once existed, when knowledge came down freely, when kingship came from the sky, when the Anunnaki walked among mortals, had faded into memory. And so humanity built, not out of pride, not out of defiance, out of longing. The ziggurats were not stairways to heaven, as later interpreters would claim. They were landing places for coming down, platforms built to invite the gods back down. Each level represented a sky sphere, a layer of the cosmos. Each tier was painted a different color. Black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, gold for the sun, mirroring the visible planets as they appeared in the night sky. At the top of each ziggurat was a small temple, a room open to the stars, furnished with a bed, a table, and offerings of food and drink, not for priests, for gods, in case they returned, in case they came down once more, as the tablets said they had before the flood, and found a place prepared for them. The structure itself was a map of the cosmos. The base represented the earthly realm, solid and square, lined up to the cardinal directions. Each going up tier symbolized a higher heaven, a layer of reality closer to the divine source. And at the top, at the meeting point of earth and sky, was the sacred chamber, the Jagunu, the place where heaven touched ground. To stand at the base of a ziggurat and look up was to see the universe shown in architecture. To climb it was to go up through the layers of creation, moving from mortal earth toward the realm of the gods. But the climb was not meant for everyone. Only priests could go up. Only those trained in the sacred rites, the hymns sung in the old tongue, the formulas that opened doorways between worlds. They would climb the external staircases, 3 or 4 flights, rising along the outer walls, carrying offerings, chanting prayers, performing rituals designed to call the gods back. But the gods did not come, or if they did, they came rarely, quietly, in dreams and visions, no longer in the radiant physical form the old tablets described. The age of direct connection was over, and the ziggurat, despite its grandness, despite its accuracy, despite the thousands of workers and decades of construction poured into its making, became a monument to absence, a structure that pointed toward something no longer there. Etemenanke, the greatest of all ziggurats, rose nearly 300 feet into the sky. 7 tiers, each one painted, each one lined up, each one encoded with astronomical and mythological meaning. It was visible for miles across the flat Babylonian plain, a man-made mountain in a land where no mountains existed. The Greek historian Herodotus visited it in the 5th century BCE and described it in awe, calling it a tower of immense size, built in stages with a spiral path going up to the top. He wrote that at the top was a temple with a great couch and a golden table where, according to the priests, the god Marduk would come down and rest. But even in Herodotus' time, the ritual was ancient, a relic, a memory of something that had once been real, but was now only acted out, performed in the hope that the old connection might somehow be restored. And then there is the story that would come later, the one that would reframe Etemenanke not as longing but as arrogance. The Tower of Babel. In the Hebrew Bible, the story is brief. Humanity, speaking one language, gathers in the plain of Shinar, Sumer, and decides to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. God, seeing this, becomes alarmed. Behold, they are one people and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And so God confuses their language. Suddenly, the builders cannot understand one another. The work stops. The tower is abandoned. Humanity scatters across the earth, divided not just by distance, but by speech. The story is told as a warning tale, a warning against pride, against the arrogance of trying to reach heaven through human effort. But that is not how the Sumerians told it. To them, the tower was not an act of defiance. It was an act of remembrance, a desperate attempt to rebuild what the flood had destroyed. Not just cities and temples, but the bridge itself, the connection between the mortal and divine, the link that had once allowed knowledge to come down freely, that had made humanity partners in creation rather than servants abandoned in the ruins. The confusion of tongues was not punishment. It was tragedy. The loss of the unified language, perhaps the original Sumerian, the Emigir, the tongue that carried the me, was not a divine order meant to humble mortals. It was the final cutting, the moment when the last thread connecting humanity to the pre-flood world snapped. After Babel, there was no single language that could encode the divine ratios, no single tongue that resonated with the structure of the cosmos. There were only pieces, dialects, scattered words that once formed a whole but now carried only parts of meaning. And without that unified language, the tower could not be completed. Not because humans lacked the engineering skill, they had built ziggurats for centuries, but because the tower's purpose was not architectural. It was communicative. It was meant to be a beacon, a signal, a point of resonance that would call the gods back. And without the language to encode that call, the structure was just stone, empty, silent, pointing toward a heaven that no longer answered. From that silence, history began. Not the history of the pre-flood world where kings reigned for tens of thousands of years and knowledge came down from above, but the history we recognize, broken, divided, mortal, nations speaking different tongues, cultures isolated by language barriers, civilizations rising and falling, each one trying to remember what had been lost, but no longer able to share that memory across the distances. The ziggurats remained, scattered across Mesopotamia, slowly wearing down under wind and rain. The priests continued their rituals, climbing the tiers, laying out offerings, singing hymns in a dead language to gods who no longer came down. And Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, stood silent in Babylon, its top open to the stars, its rooms empty, its stairways leading nowhere. A monument not to human pride, but to human longing. A structure that tried desperately to remember what it was like when heaven and earth were not divided. When the gods walked below and mortals could hear their voices. When there was one language, one knowledge, one bridge connecting all things. But the bridge was broken, and all that remained were the towers reaching upward into silence, waiting for a coming down that would never come. The desert wind passes over Iraq in the hours before dawn, carrying dust that may have once been temples. From above, from satellite view, from the silent orbit of modern observation, Mesopotamia looks like a palimpsest. Layers upon layers of civilization pressed into the earth. Each one faint, each one waiting. The ruins of Uruk barely rise above the sand. Eridu sleeps beneath excavation tarps. The ziggurat at Ur catches moonlight on its rebuilt tiers. A ghost of geometry in an empty plain. In museums across the world, behind temperature-controlled glass, the clay tablets rest. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Each one a piece of memory pressed into mud and baked hard by time. Cuneiform marks still visible, still readable, still whispering in a language no one speaks anymore. And somewhere in the silence between those marks, in the space between what was written and what was lost, a question hovers: what world existed before the flood? Because everything we have followed, every oddity, every impossible number, every piece of inherited knowledge, points to the same unsettling conclusion. The Sumerians were not the beginning. They said so themselves. In clay, in stone, in the careful geometry of their cities, they called themselves the restorers of what was before. Not the inventors, not the pioneers, the restorers. Their language appeared fully formed with no ancestors to trace. Their mathematics arrived complete with ratios and formulas that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. Their astronomy tracked cycles that required generational observation. Yet they possessed it from the start. Their cities rose geometrically lined up, architecturally advanced, as though someone had handed them a blueprint. And their own records, matter-of-fact, precise, obsessively detailed, described a world before the flood. A world of impossible kings and divine teachers. A world where knowledge came down from heaven and humanity was taught rather than left to fumble in darkness. If we take them at their word, if we read the tablets not as mythology, but as testimony, then the picture that emerges is not the birth of civilization. It is the twilight of an older one. And the flood, the great disaster that divides their history into before and after, was not the dawn of human progress. It was the moment when an earlier world drowned, and the survivors, clutching pieces of what had been lost, began the long, painful work of remembering. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as myth, allegory, the primitive attempt of ancient people to explain their origins through stories of gods and floods. But then the evidence began to build up. Geological surveys across Mesopotamia revealed layers of flood silt, clean, sterile sediment deposited suddenly, separating burned cities from rebuilt ones. Core samples from the Black Sea showed a dramatic flood roughly 7,500 years ago, when rising meltwater broke through natural barriers and drowned vast coastal regions in a matter of weeks. Satellite scans and sonar mapping uncovered underwater ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean, megalithic structures, stone circles, architectural remains resting beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, drowned when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose and the timeline began to line up. 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, the planet went through disastrous climate shifts. Glaciers collapsed. Sea levels rose by over 400 feet. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. If there were civilizations on those coasts, advanced, organized, possessing knowledge of astronomy and architecture, they would have been erased almost entirely. Only those who fled inland, who carried what they could, who remembered what had been lost, would have survived. And those survivors would have told stories. Stories of a great flood, of a world that drowned, of gods who once walked among mortals but withdrew after the waters came, of knowledge that had to be preserved, encoded, passed down so it would not vanish entirely. The Sumerians may have been the descendants of those survivors. Not the first civilization, but the first rebuilders. The ones who took the pieces, the star charts, the math formulas, the building principles, the sacred language, and pressed them into clay so they would last, so the memory would not die. And if that is true, then everything we call the birth of civilization is actually the last echo of something far older. The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Malta, the temples of Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years old, coming before Sumer, built by people who were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, yet somehow possessed the organization and skill to move stones weighing dozens of tons. These are not beginnings, they are endings, the final huge efforts of a world that knew it was fading, that built in stone, because stone would outlast memory, that encoded knowledge into geometry because words would be forgotten. The Sumerians understood this. That is why they wrote so obsessively, why they copied and recopied the king list, the flood story, the hymns to Nasaba, why they built ziggurats as landing places for gods who no longer came, why they preserved a dead language for 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken. Because they knew what it meant to lose everything. They had inherited the memory of that loss. The flood was not ancient history to them. It was living trauma passed down through generations, encoded into their identity. They were the children of survivors, the keepers of pieces, the ones given the task of making sure the world before would not be entirely forgotten. And they succeeded. For 5,000 years, their tablets have lasted. Their cities, though buried, have been excavated. Their language, though dead, has been decoded. Their star charts match our observations. Their mathematics inform our clocks. Their flood story echoes in every culture on Earth. They preserved the memory. But the warning built into that preservation is clear. Every age eventually forgets. Civilizations rise. They gather knowledge, build monuments, encode wisdom into systems they believe will last forever. And then through war, through disaster, through the slow wearing away of time, they fall. And the knowledge is lost. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that the next civilization has to start over, piecing together pieces, mistaking restoration for invention, calling progress what is really just remembrance. We are not immune to this cycle. Our own knowledge is fragile, stored in formats that decay, in systems that require maintenance, in languages and codes that future generations may not understand. If the power grids failed, if the satellites fell, if the servers went dark, how much would survive? What would we leave behind for those who came after? Perhaps clay tablets were wiser than we knew. Simple, durable, readable by anyone willing to learn the shapes, a technology of preservation that outlasted empires. The Sumerians were not primitive. They were survivors of something we are only beginning to understand. And their message, pressed into clay and buried beneath the ruins of ziggurats, is this. Remember that what you build can be lost. That knowledge is not permanent. That every flood, whether of water, fire, or time, resets the world. And only those who have encoded memory into something durable will have the chance to rebuild. The next flood is always coming. Perhaps it will be climate collapse. Perhaps nuclear war. Perhaps the slow forgetting that comes when civilizations grow too complex, too broken, too reliant on systems no one fully understands. But it will come. And when it does, the survivors, if there are survivors, will look back at our ruins the way we look back at Sumer. They will dig through our cities, decode our languages, wonder how we knew so much and why we did not listen. They will find our satellites fallen to Earth, our data centers silent, our monuments worn away. And if we are wise, they will also find something else. Something durable, something encoded, something that says this is the restoration of what was before. Because in the end, that is all any civilization can do. Preserve what matters. Pass it forward. Trust that someone somewhere in some distant age will find it and understand. The desert wind passes over Iraq in the hours before dawn, carrying dust that may have once been temples. And beneath that dust, beneath the ruins, beneath the flood silt and the burned cities and the silent ziggurats, the memory waits, patient, geometric, pressed into clay, still whispering in the dark.